There was a time, not all that long ago really, when the world breathed at a gentler pace, when mornings stretched out like soft fabric, and people woke not to a glowing screen or a vibrating notification, but to the clatter of the kettle, the murmur of birds, and the occasional distant bark of a dog, whose job was simply to greet the day louder than anyone else. You didn't check the weather because you didn't need to. You could feel it in your bones, in the air when you opened the back door, in the way the light fell through the curtains. Sometimes you just stepped outside, squinted at the sky, and trusted your instincts. And if you were wrong and the rain came anyway, well, you got wet. You laughed, or swore, or shrugged, and life went on. It's strange now to think about how much time there was, how many hours existed in a day before everything became so crowded. People talk about progress like it has always been one straight road leading towards some great destination of convenience and speed. But when you grew up without the hum of electronics tethered to your pocket, you remember a different kind of richness. Long afternoons that seemed to take their time unfolding, where nothing terribly important happened, and that was perfectly all right. Children sprawled on lawns, staring up at clouds, not because they were practicing mindfulness or participating in some carefully structured mental health ritual, but because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, and boredom wasn't something to be feared or cured. It was simply a part of life, like rain, like dust, like the slow settling of twilight. We didn't rush to fill every quiet moment. Silence lived beside us like a friendly dog, padding through the house, curling at our feet, sometimes nudging us toward daydreams we didn't know we needed. Waiting wasn't a nuisance, it was a natural shape in the day. You waited for buses, for letters, for the postman's whistle, for your favorite radio show to come on, and in that waiting, you learned patience without ever calling it patience. It was simply the air you breathed. If your friend wasn't home when you called, you rang back later. If you missed someone's voice, you didn't send them 100 messages. You looked forward to seeing them in person, and somehow that anticipation carried a sweetness that text bubbles and read receipts can't quite imitate. Somewhere along the way, we traded that slow companionship with time for the frantic urgency of constant connection, though often what we connect to now is not people at all, but streams of noise and information that clutter the mind without nourishing it. There's an odd loneliness to it. Millions of people touching glass screens instead of each other, conversations scattered like confetti across apps and platforms, hurried exchanges that never get to stretch their legs the way they used to when you sat face to face at the kitchen table and talked until the tea went cold. And even when someone tells you they feel lonely now, it comes packaged inside endless scrolling feeds, as if saying it out loud has been replaced by typing it quietly into the void, hoping the algorithm notices. Back then, evenings had a weight to them, a gentle descent into stillness. The television signed off. The national anthem might play. A test pattern hummed softly on the screen like a lullaby. Only machines could hear, and the world said, "That's enough for today." You didn't fight the night with more content. You surrendered to it. You went to bed, not because you had consumed all possible entertainment, but because the day had a beginning and an end, and there was a kind of rightness to that boundary. You lay there, listening to the house settling, to someone turning a page in the next room, to the distant sound of a neighbor's radio drifting through the window, muffled and warm like a secret shared between walls. There is something deeply human in remembering that slower world, not because it was perfect, it wasn't, and nostalgia can be dishonest if we let it, but because inside That quieter landscape lived a kind of softness we don't give ourselves much of anymore. Children disappeared for hours, not into virtual worlds, but into real creeks and paddocks, returning covered in dust and adventure, their pockets full of marbles or stones or bits of string that seemed important for reasons even they couldn't articulate. Doors stayed unlocked, not because crime didn't exist, but because trust did. The milk on the doorstep, the neighbor popping in unannounced, the familiarity of voices traveling down the street in the heat of summer evenings. All of it stitched into a fabric that felt sturdy, unhurried, tender in its ordinariness. And sure, people love to romanticize the past, often conveniently ignoring the struggles and inequalities that lived alongside those gentle memories. But the truth isn't that life was easier, only that it was simpler in ways that mattered. Not simpler because nothing ever went wrong, but simpler in the sense that the world didn't demand you be everywhere at once. You were allowed to exist in one place, in one moment, fully there, instead of constantly trying to keep up with 1,000 voices, reactions, opinions, notifications. When you were with someone, you were there, eyes and hands and attention, not dividing yourself into fragments to satisfy a machine designed to keep you on the hook. There's a quiet melancholy to remembering all this, because it feels like staring through a window into a house you once lived in. Familiar, warm, slightly faded around the edges. The furniture arranged just so, a younger version of yourself, moving through the rooms without yet knowing how precious those unremarkable days would become. And maybe that's why nostalgia stings a little. Not because the world was perfect, but because we had time to feel it, to linger, to grow bored enough that curiosity bloomed not out of desperation, but out of the natural stillness of being alive. It's not about rejecting the present or pretending technology hasn't brought incredible gifts. It has. We can speak to loved ones across oceans in an instant. We can look up history and knowledge that once took hours in libraries. We have convenience in ways our younger selves would have marveled at. But progress always asks for payment, and sometimes it feels like what we paid was silence, the kind that let us hear ourselves think, that let us miss people properly, that let us sit under a tree and watch the world happen without wondering whether we should record it. There are still days when you catch a piece of that older pace, a lazy Sunday with nothing urgent to interrupt, a long walk without headphones, a conversation where no one reaches for their phone because the company is enough, or those rare moments when you wake before the world does and the house is wrapped in that same thick hush you remember from childhood. And in those slivers of stillness, something inside you exhales. Some forgotten part of you stretches like a cat in the sun and says, "Oh, there you are. Maybe the past isn't meant to be recaptured. Maybe it only exists now in the remembering, in the stories we tell, not to insist things were better, but to remind ourselves that we once lived full lives without needing to be plugged in to feel connected." That quiet wasn't emptiness, but space, for thoughts, for wonder, for the idle drift of imagination. And perhaps all we really hope for, when we speak of those times, is not to go back, but to bring a little of that gentleness forward with us, to give ourselves permission to slow down again, to sit in the sun, doing nothing in particular, and to trust that in the end, the world will not fall apart if we choose, even briefly, to simply be.